Modernization and its discontents. State and gender in Kuwait. Mary Ann Treault and Haya al Mughni. Oil income launched Kuwait on a path of economic modernization, the myriad effects of which include pressure on boundaries separating Kuwaiti from non-Kuwaiti, elites from other social groups and classes, and women from men. Using gender as a lens, aspects of Kuwait's population policy, entitlement programs, employment and housing patterns, and family life are examined. Motives and strategies for maintaining traditional values are analyzed in the context of development imperatives and national security concerns. The dilemmas facing Kuwait and their leaders are shown to be complex and solutions often incompatible. The authors warned that policies based on the continued subordination of women often fail to provide for outcomes potentially more destabilizing than the situations they are intended to ameliorate. The initiation of commercial exports of oil from Kuwait in 1946 set in train a series of changes affecting not only the economy but also Kuwaiti social and political life. Prior to the coming of oil, the mainstays of the Kuwaiti economy were trading, fishing, boat building, and pearling. Kuwaiti society was dominated by the ruling Al Sabah family and a few important merchant families. A tribalist ideology established and supported a status hierarchy among Kuwaiti clans, and a well entrenched system of paternal and conjugal patriarchy established age and gender hierarchies within them. While most Kuwaitis accepted both hierarchies, the cosmopolitan the relatively cosmopolitan lifestyle of the merchant elite encouraged opposition to oppressive domination by the ruling family. A few merchants also ventured far enough beyond the boundaries of patriarchy to educate their daughters. Despite this occasional deviance, however, Kuwaiti social and political life remained remarkably stable in the face of repeated external intervention from European and regional powers and pressures from an economy experiencing decades long stagnation. As oil income flowed into the state, and particularly after the accession of Abdullah Salim al-Sabah as Emir of Kuwait in 1950, resources were challenged to modernize resources were channeled to modernize the local economy and improve the living standards of the population. The relative positions of dominant groups in the Kuwaiti social hierarchy were at first undisturbed by these policies. Members of the ruling family, along with wealthy merchants and key government employees, received the lion's share of cash distributions made via the land acquisition policy, which transferred lands claimed by Kuwaiti citizens to the government. Investment laws requiring majority of Kuwaiti ownership of local businesses awarded wealthy and well-connected Kuwaiti partners direct beliefs from foreign investments, while the establishment of the first Kuwaiti-owned bank in 1952 consolidated the economic dominance of five of the most powerful merchant clans. Although a small group of newly rich families sprang up, headed by clients of the ruling family who held government jobs, although a small Although a small group of newly rich families sprang up, headed by clients of the ruling family who held government jobs, enabling them to claim desirable land and win lucrative contracts, for the most part the families that had dominated the Kuwaiti economy prior to the coming of oil continued to do so afterwards. Even the new players conformed substantially to the old rules governing the kin-based organization of state and economy. The burgeoning oil economy, however, did not affect the labor market in ways that undermined the old social and political order. Economic expansion drew a flood of foreign workers to Kuwait. These included skilled professionals such as petroleum engineers, architects, and teachers, as well as semi skilled and unskilled labor to man the oil and construction industries and full various occupations in the expanding service sector. The rapidity of economic growth, unconstrained by formal planning, kept demand for foreign labor very high. In 1965, Kuwait's third national census revealed that Kuwaitis had become a minority in their own country, making up only 47% of the population. This unwelcome news heightened already existing concerns about the impact of foreign labor on political stability. Meanwhile, the government had already begun to move on the issue. In August 1962, in conjunction with the passage of Kuwait's first post-independence constitution, a state planning board was established to direct future growth and development by drawing up and supervising implementations the implementation of a series of 5-year plans. Recommendations from the first development plan, which covered the period from 1967 and 68 to 1971 and 72, left an indelible mark on Kuwaiti society. The recommendations encouraged Kuwaiti women to enter the labor market to limit the influx of foreign workers, advocating placing additional restrictions on foreign labor to enhance security, and urged an increase in welfare benefits and social privileges for Kuwaitis to promote social harmony and political stability. The prominence of recommendations designed to reinforce boundaries between Kuwaitis and foreigners by limiting the numbers and influence of foreign workers in the country reveals the dominance of national security concerns in the minds of Kuwaiti planners. Kuwaiti society, however, also faced other boundary problems. Changes in geographic environment of home and city life were proceeding rapidly. This was the result of the destruction of the old city and the construction of new housing and workplaces according to patterns reflecting normative values at variance with Kuwaiti tradition. The spread of education to the children of subordinate groups, a necessary first step to Kuwaitize the workforce, promised to challenge the dominance of the merchant families, just as merchant activism challenged the dominance of the ruling family. At the same time, the education of women and, even more, their employment outside the home threatened the dominance of fathers and husbands over the women of their families. Those desiring to maintain the legitimacy of their own right to rule the state, the economy, and their families had to face a crucial problem to reconcile the inconsistencies arising from simultaneously clinging to a tribalist ideology, while presiding over the modernization of a physical and human infrastructure pervaded by cultural diversity and political assumptions increasingly at variance with Kuwaiti tradition was very difficult indeed. In Islam and democracy, Fatma Mirnisi identifies boundary maintenance as having been a primary concern of Islamic and Mediterranean societies for centuries. Images of the veil, the walled household compound, and the walled city are images of security in these cultures, reflecting the ability of the men in charge to separate and control differences. Images of breaching images of breaching boundaries are metaphors for violence and disorder. Mernissi argues throughout her book that modernization poses continual challenges to the psychological, moral, economic, and political boundaries that maintain a particular style of religious and political leadership in the Arab Islamic world. The relevance of her observations to Kuwait is supported by analysts of the societies of the Gulf region, such as Khaldun Hassan al-Naqib. And Naqib notes that the primary strategy used by the Kuwaiti regime to maintain control of the state is playing social groups one against another as a part of a cultural complex he calls tribalism. In Kuwait, the process of modernization is also a process of boundary transgression. In this article, we examine the pressures of modernization on Kuwait by analyzing its impact on women. Applying Mernissi's argument to Kuwait, women's position there is not merely subordinate to men, but under their direct control. This is not only a social reality reinforced by religious prescriptions, it is also a metaphor for social control and community security. For example, the Arabic word fitna, used to describe disorder and chaos, also means civil war. The same word is used to describe the power of female sexuality to tempt men. Together with these other meanings, fitna places women in the position of what Elaine Pagels calls the intimate enemy. The threat from this fearsome other is compounded by the fact that her life is inextricably embedded in one's own. Thus, the boundary conflicts arise from the need to modernize to take full advantage of Kuwait's ephemeral oil wealth and the incompatible desire to preserve a community ideal. That ideal, not coincidentally, supports a particular distribution of power and authority in Kuwaiti society, and is likely to be most clearly defined by the struggles over women's roles and civil rights. Citizenship and nationality boundaries. Under the Citizenship Law of 1959, Kuwaiti nationals were defined as those persons and their descendants who resided in Kuwait prior to 1920 and maintained residence there until 1959. The small size of the Kuwaiti population, 113,622 persons out of the total of 206,407 1953 and 1957 stimulated the adoption of a population policy aimed at increasing the Kuwaiti birth rate. This policy developed over time to include an array This policy developed over time to include an array of financial incentives such as monthly allowances for each child, maternity benefits, and housing loans designed to encourage Kuwaitis to have large families. Government housing, which was provided for middle and low income families, in order to permit Kuwaiti women to reconcile family responsibilities with the state's desire that women work outside the home, nursery facilities for working mothers were also provided. Kuwaiti nationalism is based on the concept of al-usra al-wahida, the single or united family, adopted as a symbol of the nation in the early 1970s to promote national cohesion. The term resonates with mythic idealizations of the old tribal families of the Arabian Peninsula, in which everyone took care of everyone else and all lived securely under the protective wing of the family patriarch. The Kuwaiti media were encouraged by a new social policies committee set up by the state's planning board to increase family members' awareness of their duties and responsibilities toward one another. They were asked to promote family values based on obedience to the male head of the household, respect for the elderly, and care for the young. The committee wanted to articulate the relations of family rights and obligations within the context of the society as a whole. It depicted the nation as a collective family characterized by reciprocal relations of the rights and obligations, al-Usra al-Wahida, with the Emir at its head. In this way, the values symbolic of solidarity and mutual aid among family members were used to create allegiance to the monarchic state. The promotion of such the promotion of such close identification between the patriarchal family and the patriarchal state created a close interdependence between those two institutions. Loyalty to the patriarchal family became, in the 1970s, analogous to loyalty to the ruling family, making the preservation of the patriarchal family a political issue transcending the myriad abuses of human rights inherent in the subordination of women to patriarchal control. The continuity of the monarchy also depended on the maintenance of specific lineage and blood ties. Restrictions on female citizens' entitlements and the imposition of penalties on Kuwaiti women who married non Kuwaitis also became policies aimed at social control and national boundary demarcation. Kuwaiti women who marry outside the group along with their families are marginalized. In contrast, the families of Kuwaiti men who marry non-Kuwaitis are treated no differently from families in which both spouses are Kuwaitis. Conceiving citizenship as passing from father to son, Kuwaiti women married to foreigners become mothers of non-Kuwaiti children who, like their fathers, are denied political, economic, and social protections to which Kuwaitis are entitled. Marriage to foreigners also causes Kuwaiti women to lose some of their own rights. In 1982, Kuwaiti women married to non-Kuwaiti men lost their right to own government housing. Their right to government housing loans was rescinded in 1993. Discrimination against Kuwaiti women married to non-Kuwaitis appears even more unjust in cases where the non-Kuwaiti spouse is Bedouin. The Bedouin are stateless nationals, some of whom have lived in Kuwait for several generations. True Bedouin are former nomads whose nationality status was never clarified or declared by their family heads in the past. Kuwaitis suspect, however, that many Bedouin are not really stateless nomads but rather Iraqis or Saudis who deny their nationality as a way to gain entitlement to superior Kuwaiti economic, social, and political rights. Until the late 1980s, the settlement and participation of Bedouin in Kuwaiti life were welcomed because Bedouin men constituted a large pool of willing recruits for Kuwaiti security forces. The status of the Bedouin was so close to that of certified Kuwaiti nationals that in census tallies carried out prior to the Iraqi invasion, the Bedouin were counted as part of the Kuwaiti population rather than as non-Kuwaitis. In response to the deterioration of the Kuwaiti economy following the collapse of oil prices in the mid-1980s, however, the Bedouin began to be squeezed out of the domestic labor force by demands that all expatriate workers show their nationality papers. Since the Bedouin by definition had no such papers, they could not produce them for their employers, and many were fired from their jobs. The economic and social marginality of the Bedouin increased following liberation in 1991. It progressed to such an extent that government population statistics were revised in 1992, reclassifying the Bedouin as non-Kuwaitis. The identities of the Bedouin and their families have been similarly disrupted by the decision of the Kuwaiti government to move the boundary separating Kuwaitis from non-Kuwaitis, perhaps no more poignantly than in those cases where the wives of the Bedouin are Kuwaiti nationals. In 1990, the number of Kuwaiti women married to non-Kuwaiti men reached a total of 5,322 women. It was not until Kuwait's liberation from Iraq in 1991, however, when their economic circumstances deteriorated sharply as the result of the government's new policy requiring formal proof of nationality for every worker, that these women decided to organize to improve their situation. In April 1991, a group of housewives from low to middle income groups, along with a few highly educated women, attempted to form an association. The government refused to grant the group a license, thus denying it the right to operate officially and to receive the state support available to recognized groups. Members used the premises of the Environmental Protection Society (EPS) as their headquarters until they were evicted by the all-male boards of EPS in 1992. In February 1993, the Women's Cultural and Social Society (WCSS) added the issue of Kuwaiti women married to non-Kuwaitis to their agenda. Class boundaries and the emergence of new classes. The spread of education among members of formerly disadvantaged groups in Kuwaiti society have promoted the development of a new class of able and ambitious Kuwaitis who did not come from the old powerful families, having neither the capital to start their own business nor the political connections to win monopolies, dealerships, or agencies. These, at first mostly male Kuwaitis, gravitated to positions that, like themselves, were also products of economic modernization. They became managers in the state's oil company and professors at Kuwait University, both non executive positions. Most executive jobs are filled by members of important families, requiring high levels of education and or skills. The dependence of the state and the economy on high levels of technical competence created protected spaces from which ambitious non-elite men could challenge the economic and status dominance of the old Kuwaiti elites. At the same time, demands for gender equality were made by young women from the merchant class, many encouraged by men from their own social stratum. Most of these early Kuwaiti feminists had been educated abroad. By speaking out, they shattered the old social rules requiring women to be silent and secluded. They wrote and spoke only about the issues that mattered most to themselves, that is, the veil and women's access to education and employment. Their protests against the veil were occasionally quite dramatic. In 1956, for example, in 1956, for example, four young merchant class women took off their abayas, long black cloaks that cover women from head to toe that are worn outside the house, and set them on fire in their schoolyard. These vigorous and persistent demands for change had an important bearing on the rapid introduction of women into the public sphere. These vigorous and persistent demands for change had an important bearing on the rapid introduction of women into the public sphere and their rise to visibility. Elite women were the first to be employed outside the home and the first to drop the veil. Ending female seclusion served the interests of the merchant class. To maintain its own position of dominance, it was ready to change Kuwaiti social mores so that elite women of the merchant class could take over prestigious positions that might otherwise go to men from the emerging social classes. As Denise Candioti noted, educated upper class women pose less of a threat to the status quo than upwardly mobile men from modest backgrounds. The recruitment of such women allows the elite to fill vacancies caused by a shortage of qualified men from their own class. Elite Kuwaiti women thus played an important role in class politics. Their public activities, though undertaken in the guise of actions that benefit women as a group, serve their class interests at least as much as their gender interests. Kuwaiti women's organizations are similarly embedded in class politics. The first two were established in 1963, the WCSS and the Arab Women's Development Society (AWDS). The WCSS provided a gathering place for educated, merchant class women whose comfortable lives and well paying jobs were not enough to save them from boredom, and who were wealthy enough to indulge in charity work. The AWDS, composed mostly of women from the new middle class, expanded the feminist struggle, demanding not only political rights but also restrictions on patriarchal authority within the family. The AWDS challenge to interlocking the systems of patriarchy underpinning state and society in Kuwait met with fierce resistance from Kuwaiti men and from the government. Their ability to check AWDS activities was assisted by disunity and rivalry between the two women's organizations. At first, the WCSS and then the AWDS joined forces under the umbrella of the Kuwaiti Women's Union, which was established in 1974. Their members, however, failed to agree on common aspirations. The union lasted for less than 3 years, consumed by internal conflicts and protracted infighting over the presidency of the unified group. Shortly after, in 1980, AWDS itself was disbanded. The government subsequently encouraged the formation of a number of religiously oriented women's groups, shifting the character of women's public discourse from demands for autonomy to the advocacy of values whose partial effect is to reinforce female subjection. These new women's groups are largely comprised of elite women, including the wife of the crown prince. They work closely with the government and endorse its views on women's issues. They reject what AWDS fought for, such as reforms in family law that would promote gender equality and women's autonomy, and use religion to defend the patriarchal family and women's subordinate role within it. They do not challenge discriminatory welfare policies or other structural manifestations of female subjection in Kuwait. The WCSS, along with another elite women's group, Nadi al Fatat, Young Women's Club, continued to pursue political rights for women, though so far they have had only a small impact on prevailing male attitudes toward women's roles in society and politics. The economic and social problems of divorced and widowed women, however, have been ignored by these groups, along with even modest demands for changes that would benefit women from the middle class, such as the expansion of women's access to sports and recreation facilities. Demands that would benefit women from every class, such as the protection of women and children against domestic violence, improvement of job security, and expansion of access to vocational training are also not dealt with. Indeed, relations between the elite organizations and women from lower social strata are confined primarily to charity. For example, an early and continuing project of the WCSS is sponsoring literacy classes for adult women. Such relationships reinforce traditional class distinctions rather than help Kuwaiti society to democratize. On balance, state and class interests appear to combine in a way that renders Kuwaiti women's groups pawns into a strategy of social control rather than core organizations working to promote human rights. The group's activities have conformed to official policies toward women's roles in society. They emphasize Islah, reform, rather than social change. State charters and resource transfers encourage conformity to official policy among women's group members and their leaders. Recognized organizations are the only legitimate forums in which Kuwaiti women can speak publicly about their concerns. Affiliation with a recognized organization, however, forces women whose agendas are at variance with the status quo to dissipate their efforts by spreading their organizational involvement to include issues less relevant to their concerns. Peer pressure within these organizations also limits the style and content of demands regarding the primary problem the dissidents come together to resolve. Thus, women's groups paradoxically censor and inhibit the emergence of autonomous roles for women in Kuwait by providing elite women with the power to control other women's access to the public sphere. To the thus, thus, women's groups paradoxically censor and inhibit the emergence of autonomous roles for women in Kuwait by providing elite women with the power to control other women's access to the public sphere. Urbanization and spatial boundaries. Old Kuwait was dominated by a group of merchant families, many descended from the Bani Utayb tribe that had settled Kuwait in the 18th century. These families lived close to one another, each in its own firij or neighborhood. They evolved to become a distinct and powerful group, providing jobs for much of the community and supplying the ruling family with a regular income in the form of customs duties and excises. They maintained strict endogamy, marrying only within their own lineage. They maintained strict endogamy, marrying only with their own lineage. Their women lived in their own courtyards, secluded from the outside world and confined to a section of the house without windows opening to the outside, so that they could neither be seen nor heard. These women had slaves and servants to do the daily marketing outside the home and to perform domestic tasks inside the home. They were strictly forbidden to leave their courtyards except to visit relatives or to picnic in the desert with their families in the spring. When they did go outside, they had to cover their bodies with their abayas and their faces with a thick black cloth, the boshiya. Women of poor and middle income families were not entirely secluded, as most of these households could not afford servants. Some housewives had to do their own shopping and fetch for families' water supply from the port, where ships brought in water from Iraq. Because of the water shortage, women had to take their laundry to the beach and wash it. Other families were so poor that women had to work outside the home to help support them. Strict rules of gender segregation, however, confined their economic activities to the women's quarters of wealthy households, to the women's souk market, and to home-based enterprises such as schools for religious instruction. Even though they were not entirely secluded, however, women from poor households were equally constrained by norms of family honor and female respectability. They had to be unquestionably chaste, marry the men chosen for them, and obey the male heads of their household. New Kuwait rose from the shambles of old neighborhoods, the buildings of which were knocked down and pushed into the sea to make way for new construction. New housing developments were built along the modern highway system, and houses and business offices were constructed according to the plans of foreign architects. Houses and apartment blocks seldom included places to sequester women from the eyes and ears of neighbors and passerbys. Houses and apartment blocks seldom included places to sequester women from the eyes and ears of neighbors and passers-by. Family life changed as well. When Kuwaitis began moving from houses with separate women's quarters to Western style homes where only the men's diwaniya or reception room was isolated while the rest of the family quarters were integrated. Girls left these homes to go to school and women left them to go to work. Working women from the merchant class took professional positions in private firms, government offices, and the university. Soon, other women also moved into living and work spaces that made no special provision for gender segregation. They drove their own cars. They drove their own cars, wore Western style clothing, and lived more like their contemporaries in Beirut or Cairo than as their mothers and grandmothers had lived. The new neighborhoods introduced new boundaries based on nationality, age cohort, and family status. Some featured rental housing for expar- expatriate workers, where in the early some featured rental housing for expatriate workers, where in the early era of modernization, people encouraged people con some featured rental housing for expatriate workers, where in the early era of modernization, people congregated by country of origin. Hawali, for example, was the neighborhood where many Palestinians living in Kuwait resided. A few neighborhoods like Shuwaykh are areas where merchant families have built new homes. Shia Kuwaitis live in large numbers in Sharq, an old city neighborhood, and in the new suburb of Rumaithia. Bedouin families are concentrated outside the center city in Jahra, around the oil town of Ahmadi, along the south coast. Government housing programs channel families into neighborhoods based on the age of the lead of household or his occupation. Thus, there are yuppie suburbs like Mishrif and company towns like Ahmadi. Yuppie suburbs developed spontaneously as the result of the states repeatedly having had to open new housing areas to accommodate succeeding age cohorts of Kuwaitis seeking to become householders, while the company towns emerged as the direct outcome of state agencies such as Kuwait University and the Kuwait Oil Company, providing housing to some classes of employees as part of their compensation. All neighborhoods are mixed, that is, they include families who do not conform to the mode for that era. All neighborhoods are mixed, that is, they include families who do not conform to the mode for that area. In older neighborhoods, older dwellings remain alongside newer modern houses. Even so, residential segregation is a fact of Kuwaiti life and is shaped by Kuwaiti politics and culture. Government housing policies also enforce segregation by family type. Unmarried men not living with their families are assigned to bachelor housing, probably to keep them from trying to establish relationships with unrelated women, almost all of whom live with their relatives in areas designated for families. Childless couples are assigned apartments rather than private houses, access to which goes preferentially to families with children. This is both to encourage childbearing and rearing and to provide sufficient space for children activities. As family status changes, people are offered opportunities to upgrade their housing or are removed from desirable premises to which they are no longer entitled. If a husband dies, leaving a wife alone in their house, the state may repossess the house to give it to a family with children, unless the widow can show that relatives of the deceased live there with her. The allocation of the best housing to families is both an element in the state's pronatalist policy and the reinforcement of traditional social norms requiring adult children, especially females, to live in their parents' home until they marry. In recent years, Kuwait has seen an increase in the number of impoverished female headed households. This is a new phenomenon with multiple causes, the chief of which is an increase in the number of divorces after which husbands cannot or will not support their former wives. The number of divorces involving at least one Kuwaiti partner, which had been creeping upward since the mid 1970s, rose sharply in the 1980s and reached a pre-Iraqi invasion peak in 1986. A drop in the number of divorces and marriages occurred in 1991, the first year of liberation, but the number of divorces reached a new high in 1992, the last year for which data are available. Even though the law requires fathers to support their children after a divorce, the cumbersome and time consuming procedures of the Kuwaiti judicial system create financial hardships for many lower and middle class Kuwaiti women. Some female household heads have appealed for support from the state, which ordinarily channels citizens' welfare entitlements through male heads of household, Rabb al-Usra. Poor women living on their own or with their dependent children do not fit the categories the government has established for allocating welfare benefits. If they hold jobs or have living male relatives, they are usually denied public assistance. In 1992, 308 applications by women declaring a need for state support were denied on the grounds that the applicants were either employed or should be supported by male relatives. Housing is a further problem for women requiring social assistance. Kuwaiti women are not entitled to own government supplied or subsidized housing, a privilege that goes only to the male heads of households. To meet the needs of female household heads, the government has constructed special apartment buildings in remote areas in which to house them. One such neighborhood is in Sabah al-Salam residential area located south of Kuwait City on the 6th Ring Road, where construction began in the mid-1970s. As in other Kuwaiti neighborhoods, residential segregation in Sabah al-Salam includes more than one population group, although its status as a government project enables officials to select each family living in Sabah al-Salam individually. According to officials in the Ministry of Housing, childless couples and Kuwaiti women married to non-Kuwaitis are also housed there, along with widowed and divorced women. All three categories of persons are socially marginalized groups. Women on social assistance receive rent subsidies to enable them to maintain themselves in these apartments. Their geographic isolation is a reflection of the complete absence of a social space in which their existence is recognized as legitimate if not normal. The divorced and widowed mothers in these neighborhoods are stigmatized as unworthy women with loose morals. Their isolation makes them vulnerable to crime, and their reputations legitimize male violence against them. Crimes ranging from vandalism to sexual harassment and rape are daily occurrences within these grimy residential compounds. To protect themselves, women place iron bars on their doors and windows, making their buildings look more like jails than like homes. Residents remain indoors most of the time, rarely socializing with their neighbors, thus intensifying the prison-like quality of their existence. Both male violence and the stigma attached to residential areas allocated to female household heads act as deterrents to many single mothers in desperate need of government-assisted rental housing, but whose willingness to live in neighborhoods like Sabah Salim is diminished by fears for their own and their children's safety. Post-liberation budget cuts, the curtail welfare program, threaten even the precarious refugee refuge for highly marginalized and discriminated against Kuwaiti women. Conclusions. The Kuwaiti state is caught between two opposing forces. One is the relentless pressure of modernization, with its disruption of every aspect of settled life, from patterns of land usage to personal, personal relationships. The other is an intense longing to maintain tradition. This force is also complex, arising from fear and disenchantment with the problems that modernization inevitably brings. Preserving tradition is also important to those whose positions are dependent upon maintaining the old social order to hold onto their privileges. Women are a pivotal group, symbolically and in reality, in strategies that the state devises to manipulate and balance these forces. The conceptualization of women as the intimate enemy makes their control by men a primary focus of concern, especially for men whose status and power are threatened by an independent civil status. They are barred from receiving their full entitlements as citizens in the absence of mediation by male family members who must be citizens themselves. This is most clearly demonstrated in the case of women who marry non Kuwaitis. They incur civil penalties from as well as rejection by those among their fellow citizens who see such marriages as a sign of disloyalty. The denial of independent civil status is also visible in the treatment of Kuwaiti women who fail to conform to social norms in other ways. Divorced and widowed women Divorced and widowed Kuwaiti women are unable to claim their full rights as citizens, and some cannot even remain in their local communities. Vulnerable and powerless, they, along with their children, are marginalized socially, economically, and geographically. Symbolically, in both cases, the lesson of gender is that those who stay within traditional boundaries are rewarded. If this lesson is taken to heart, it promotes social stability and protects the benef- beneficiaries of the status quo, that is, the political regime, economic elites, and male heads of households. The articulation and defense of an identical male gender interest, both within and across other social hierarchies, is a key stabilizing element in this system. Gender is also a strategic card in power plays where men's interests conflict. Elite women participate along with elite men in the reproduction and preservation of class and status hierarchies. They can do this as the result of their status advantages over new men in the competition for top jobs in the state sector, and by acting as gatekeepers in the gender segregated organizations they populate and lead by thwarting those ambitions of non elite women who threaten the status quo. The alliance of upper class women with men who dominate Kuwait's political economy has obstructed the improvement of women's status nationwide. It has also prevented an effective organization of women whose interests lie in normalizing the status of boundary crossers rather than leaving it as it is today, a legitimate target of economic and social sanctions. Yet, Although the gender card helps to preserve the status quo, it also contributes to the rapid growth of an underclass of women and children. Their existence rends the facade of tradition, exposing an ugly reality at wide variance with the myth of al-Usra al-Wahida. The weak economy and the population growth resulting from 40 years of pronatalist social policies aggravate tensions created by the unfinished business of modernization. Competition within and between classes for desirable jobs or for employment of any kind, as well as widespread dissatisfaction with the regime, have produced various kinds of disaffection. Economic modernization multiplies the channels through which this disaffection can be expressed and spread across the community. Strikes, unemployment, and reduced levels of social services pit Kuwaitis against one another for crumbs from a shrinking economic pie, whose largest piece continued to feed the ruling family and traditional elites. Despite its apparent harmony with traditional values, Islamism among young Kuwaitis may be understood as both a measure of their thwarted ambitions and an indication that the status quo is breaking down. As Mernisi notes with respect to other Arab societies, Islamic fundamentalism occurs hand in hand with feminism because both are products of the same social forces. There are two groups that have profited from modern education: men from the countryside and lower classes, who make up a disproportionate part of fundamentalist movements, and city women of the middle and upper classes. The problem is that the fundamentalists act with the complicity of the state, while women struggle alone. Kuwait is also marked by a conflict of interest between the newly educated sons of urban workers and Bedouin fathers and the women who both literally and figuratively outclass them. The government, with its fear of fitna resulting from women escaping male control, has forgotten that fitna also refers to civil war between men. Thus, it has accepted and, according to some observers, even aided Islamist forces, with the petitions of Kuwaiti women for full civil and human rights have been ignored. Yet, as the experiences of Algeria, Egypt, and Iran make clear, fundamentalists with their veneer of traditional values are at least as dangerous to the survival of autocratic regimes as female autonomy. The thoughtless abandonment of growing underclass composed of Kuwaiti women and their children is another example of social situation where symbolic solutions ignore a potentially explosive reality. Concentrating on the competition between themselves, rulers and merchants became blind to the changes that oil money brought to social groups whose political weight had been negligible throughout most of Kuwait's history. A new middle class and a variety of national and non-national underclasses have gradually begun to emerge, crossing the boundary, insulating elites from subordinate groups and making demands of their own. The traditional manipulation of women as counters in competition between Kuwaiti men has become problematic as women themselves increasingly compete against men or join with some men to compete against others. Kuwait's peculiar blend of dependencies, especially its dependence on external labor and externally generated income, makes it difficult to force any of these upstart groups back into its former subject status. The unwillingness of the old elites to face this new reality is expressed by redrawing boundaries in the hope that the old technique of divide and rule can be made to work again. Our examination of the position of women in Kuwait showed that this primarily symbolic politics has been ineffective in moderating the pace of change.